Well, this is it, folks. The night we have all been waiting for. It is, without a doubt, the most prestigious night of the year on the literary calendar. It's Giller time.
If Margaret Atwood happens to be in the audience, what do I do?
Never look her in the eye.
Why?
She will knock you down. Tonight, 5 Canadian authors compete for the richest prize in Canadian literature.
$100,000 from our dedicated sponsor, Scotiabank. Yeah.
It's the very best thing can happen to a writer because the jury is your peers.
It's been the greatest privilege to get to know my fellow nominees and to be shortlisted with such brilliant writers.
It's not about celebrities, it's not about fame, it's not about bestsellers, it's just about books.
But I always think when I finish a book that I'm never going to write another novel anyway.
Writing fiction it's almost like professional voyeurism.
Anybody who writes a book of any kind is essentially an optimist because, first of all, they're assuming they'll finish the book, and they're assuming someone will then read the book.
The impact of the Giller is undeniable. Since 1994, this award has generated a phenomenal $60 million in book sales.
You have no idea how special this is for me.
Thank God for people like Jack Rabinovich who put it up front where it belongs.
In the immortal words of my dad, I know you've all been waiting for this.
For the price of dinner for 2 in this town, you can buy all the books. So eat at home and read the books.
Have you ever just given away $100,000?
Only to Revenue Canada, so this will be a lot.
And the winner of the Scotiabank Giller Prize is...
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first ever virtual edition of Between the Pages, an exclusive, in-depth conversation with all the shortlisted finalists for the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize. I'm Jael Richardson, author and the book columnist for CBC Radio's Q, and I'm thrilled to be your host. This is a very special evening celebrating the best in Canadian literature. For the last 7 years, Between the Pages has toured Canada and also been featured in London, England, and New York City. But since this year, as you know, we can't take the authors on the road, we're thrilled to bring the excitement right into your home. For over a quarter of a century, the Scotiabank Giller Prize has reflected our love and devotion to the art of storytelling. The prize was founded by the extraordinary and beloved Jack Rabinovich in honor of his late wife, literary journalist Doris Giller, 27 years ago, and has grown to become the most generous literary prize in Canada. Between the Pages was established so that book lovers across Canada could get up close and personal with the Scotiabank Giller Prize finalists. And it was the executive director of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, Alana Rabinovich, who created this remarkable event in partnership with Scotiabank. Tonight, you'll hear readings from all 5 of the shortlisted books, and after, we'll find out what inspires the authors and their process of creating these stories that captivate us, that transform us, and entertain us. Sponsors are what make the arts soar, especially in times like these, and we want to acknowledge the exceptional team at Scotiabank and Scotia Wealth Management who have dedicated their passion not only to this prize, but to supporting arts and culture across Canada. It is with thanks to Scotia Wealth Management that once again this year, the Scotiabank Giller Prize will be broadcast commercial-free on CBC Monday, November 9th, with host Eric McCormick and special musical guest Diana Krall. Our special thanks as well to our Between the Pages sponsors, our broadcast partner CBC, the Globe and Mail, Audible, and Ben McNally books. Now, let's go between the pages. Please join me in welcoming this year's incredible finalists. Gil Adamson, David Bergen, Emily St. John Mandel, Shani Mootoo, and Souvankham Thammavongsa. Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, let me ask you, I know you've all written books before, but I imagine that having a book come out over the last 7 or 8 months might have been a little different than usual. And so I wonder, what's it been like launching your most recent book in quarantine? Shani, why don't you start us off?
When the shutdown occurred, that was exactly when my book was to be launched. And I thought that the book was going to die. And I really worried. I felt this was a really, really good book that I'd written, and nothing was going to happen with it. But, the festivals got on board. Everybody went, doing these virtual events and so on. And I was really surprised at how much support we were all getting through these kinds of events. And it almost seems to me as if reviewers and magazines and newspapers and so on were really paying us more attention. The CBC, certainly, the National Arts Council, Center for the Arts, and I feel as if we're sort of learning a new way that may well translate into new abilities for us as writers.
I love it.
You might as well look at it like that.
David, what do you think?
Like Shani, my book came out just a day before the world shut down, basically, while Canada, along with the rest of the world. And I did a book launch where there were actually people, and we were all sort of eyeing each other warily, like, why are we here? That sort of thing. And then after that, there was like Shani said, nothing, and it was the strangest thing. It's like you fall into a vacuum. And I remember saying to my editor, Dan Wells, well, books can have second lives, and they can have third lives, and I feel like this is for me and for my book a wonderful second life.
Emily, how's it been for you? I know you're in New York right now. I don't know if you've been there the whole time. I guess so. How has it been for you?
Life was generally pretty bad in New York over the spring. But in terms of the book specifically, I've just felt incredibly fortunate that, as Shani and David have said, that there has been attention paid to books during this fairly dire time. So my pub date was March 24th. So about, 12 days after the world shut down. I had a 25-city tour on the calendar, which we canceled one city and one country at a time. And I have to say, promoting a book via Zoom is actually much less weird than I thought it would be. I thought it would be this terrible kind of alienating experience. But it turns out that talking to people still feels like talking to people, even though I much prefer, and I very much wish I could do it in person. So in a lot of ways, it's been a lot better than I would have imagined publishing a book during this time.
Jill, what about you?
Everything you guys have said is my experience as well. My book came out in May, and I worried, as other people did, that after spending more than a decade writing the book, it would just disappear, and I didn't have very high hopes for it. And I was also worried about my publisher because and publishers in Canada and everywhere, because nobody really knew how they were going to handle what could turn into 2 or 3 seasons of lost revenue. But you're exactly right. I think it was Shani that said it. It's amazing how people just got out and pushed, and we're still just as passionate about books. And somehow, including the Giller, managed to figure out how to keep going and to do it in a way that's maybe even a little more intimate, I hope.
Well, one of the things is we're going to be all together watching this. Usually between the pages, we sort of go to different cities, and now we're doing it together. So that's really exciting. Souvankham, how's it been for you?
It didn't feel all that different than like launching a poetry book, in that, there wasn't I didn't get to go out and meet readers. But everything that I could possibly do for the book had been done a year ago. And I can't control what kind of world my book comes out to. A book is a book, and no pandemic can change what it is between the pages.
Well, now we're going to move to my favorite part of the evening, which is the readings. And we're going to begin with Gil Adamson. Gil Adamson is the critically acclaimed author of The Outlander, which won multiple awards and was even a finalist for CBC's own Canada Reads. She's also the author of a collection of linked stories and 2 poetry collections. Tonight, she reads from her shortlisted book, Ridgerunner. The jury said this long-awaited sequel to The Outlander evokes a mythic landscape while drawing richly on both the Western and on Gothic fiction. Please welcome Gil Adamson.
The safe in the mine boss's office was new. The matte black box stood as high as Moreland's chest, and it had a thick brass handle and painted filigree around the combination dial. He approached it and saw a blur of scratches and dings around the entire circumference of the door, where drunken miners had tried in vain to use their tools to pry it open. In the end, he knew it wouldn't work, but tried anyway, because Mary Bolton would want him to. When the last night shift was still hours from coming topside, and the day shift slumbered in their little houses, he took 4 half-charged sticks of Etna extra dynamite with a combined weight strength of 80% and tucked them under the brass handle of the safe like cigars in a man's breast pocket. Then he lit the fuses and ran halfway down the external wooden staircase and curled up in a fetal ball. No novice at destruction, Moreland had used blasting sticks while on logging crews, on road work, and in mines, including this one in St. Croix, Montana. He'd been so prudent with the stuff, so nimble and clever, that eventually blasting became his only job. He was sure-footed, and he was shrewd, and most of all, William Moreland was fast. So it was also his task to dispose of old, unstable explosives, walking into the mouth of this very entrance as men bellowed, "Here he comes." Entering the evacuated mine alone, lantern tied to his hip and swinging, holding those bombs in his gloved hands, a hoarfrost of crystallized explosive that had leaked through the paper sheaths and now clung there like flakes of salt. He'd made his careful way to the edge of an exhausted and abandoned shaft, opened his gloved hands like a devil in an opera, and released those sticks into the dark, where they fell for 2 breaths and landed unseen atop all the other garbage down there. The broken carts, winches and wheels, and pick handles, the rotted rope and clothing, tin cans, these skeletons of expired pit ponies. Sometimes he heard a distant whump and felt a body blow in the constricted air of the shaft. Sometimes he didn't. He always slid off the gloves too and let them flutter into the hole. William Moreland, young and cocky back then, striding back up the lonely stope with his lantern held high and a grin on his bloodless face, following a pinhole of daylight. So the particularities of wood and stone and pebbled earth, of explosion and implosion, impact and scatter, were as familiar to him as his own hands. But this safe was solid steel. He knew what would happen, and it did. The blast knocked the safe onto its back, reduced every window in the place to flying daggers, and removed half the office floor. The roar was horrific. In the silence afterward, everything in the room began a leisurely slide toward the jagged hole, and piece by piece, everything in that room fell out into the world.
Thank you, Jill. Our next shortlisted author is David Bergen, who has published 8 novels and a collection of short stories. His work has been nominated for the Governor General's Literary Award, among others, and he won the Scotiabank Giller Prize in 2005 for his novel, The Time in Between. Now he's back on the shortlist with Hear the Dark, which the jury calls a story collection of masterly skill and tension, filled with delicately wrought characters that affirm Bergen among Canada's most powerful writers. Reading an excerpt from the title novella, Hear the Dark, please welcome David Bergen.
Her parents were sitting at the dining room table when she came down the stairs. Her uncle Hans was there as well. The book was face up on the table. Lily paused in the doorway. Her father told her to sit with them. She did so. Her father pointed at the book and said, "What is this?" "It is not mine," she said. "Where did you get it?" She did not answer. Her mother sighed. Her father picked up the book and opened it and read. The passage he had chosen was sexual and frank. Lily wondered how he had found that passage. When he finally halted, he placed the book on the table and he said, "How can this be edifying?" Lily shrugged. He had no answer. "Have there been other books?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you lying?" She shook her head. And then Uncle Hans spoke. His voice was softer than her father's, and he said her name, Lily. And then he said that ideas and images that come from the outside were forever dangerous, because those ideas worked from the outside to the inside, and then back to the outside, so that what were our thoughts now became our actions. He said that he would go outside and he would build a fire, and he wanted Lily to come out with the book, and together they would burn it. "It's not mine to burn," she said. "Whose then?" He didn't answer. Her father and her uncle rose and left the room, and this left her with her mother, whose face was hard. "Filth," her mother said. Was this true? Lily did not know. She wondered how it was possible to enjoy reading filth, for she had, and she hadn't. And then she realized that her mother was not referring to the books, but to her, Lily. She was filth. In time, Lily stood and picked up the book and walked outside. The sun was setting, the light was soft, and the sky was gray blue, and the clouds were few. The fire was burning in a half barrel close to the barn. She approached her uncle, who stood alone and who gestured at the fire. Lily stepped forward and dropped the book into the flames. It did not burn immediately, for it was tightly bound, and even when it did begin to burn, the interior pages remained untouched. And so her uncle took up an iron rod and prodded at the book, and he opened it so that the fire might attack all of it. During that time, no words were spoken. There was just the action of her uncle spearing at the pages and turning them and offering them to the fire. Then it was finished, and only ashes were left. Her uncle turned and walked back to the house. Lily remained. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she looked for a sign that might have perhaps arrive in the physical world around her. And here the clouds, like many dark sheep gone astray, and here the orange sun burning the world, and here the hair that hides from the circling hawk, and here the stretched singing of waterlogged frogs, and here the light, and here the dark.
Thank you, David. Our third author tonight is Shani Mootoo. In addition to being a visual artist whose work has been exhibited locally and internationally, Shani Mootoo's critically acclaimed novels have earned her multiple award recognition, including being previously shortlisted for the Booker Prize, as well as the Scotiabank Giller Prize. This year's jury calls her novel, Polar Vortex, a keen meditation on the complexities of identity and desire. Please welcome Shani Mootoo.
Were we really safe enough, though? I still wonder about that sometimes. Sitting in the car, the only people on that road facing an expanse of frozen water as far as one could see. Meters from us, massive iceberg-like formations. Frozen waves piled one atop the other. Knife-edged cliffs jutted out of the ice boulders into the sky and then dropped off into gem-like blue and green canyons. I'd brought my window down a fraction, and we listened. A heaving, thumping rebellion came from beneath the surface. It wasn't a stretch to imagine water undulating, restless, captive, wanting an escape from all that ice. It felt as if the force of the moving water beneath might actually any second wrench the boulders from whatever anchored them and send them skidding toward the road, shoving us into trees or mercifully simply crushing us flat. What seemed like a choreographed row of geysers 7 powerful spouts, one after the other, in quick succession, rose every few minutes into the air. What seemed like a choreographed row of geysers, 7 powerful spouts, one after the other, in quick succession, rose every few minutes into the air. I'll never forget the tinkling 1 minute, like a crystal chandelier in an earthquake, and that insistent thumping, I say, then laugh. And you told me that Lake Ontario was the smallest of the Great Lakes and the 13th largest in the world. He nods. It sounded alive, as if it were breathing. The music from the blowholes, it was like a strange tune played on an oboe, he says. And although she remains glum, I feel grateful. And do you remember you quoted Hardy? I ask. She takes a puff and nods. After her long exhalation, she says, "The sun was white as though chidden of God." I was not surprised that she knew Hardy's poem, but I was impressed that out of her brain, she was able to pick an appropriate literary phrase to describe the scene in front of us. Impressed, but not surprised. On the way home, in another, more sheltered section of the lake, where swans are known to gather for the winter, I brought the car to a crawl so we could see how they were faring. On the glass surface, we counted 13 swans frozen stiff, some as if in full swim, some off kilter, some sprawled on the surface, their wings unnaturally bent, stuck in parts to the ice while tips of feathers flapped in the wind. That was this same year, just 11 months ago. The feeders in our yard had remained empty until the middle of what was supposedly spring, but still felt like winter. The moment I was able to, I went out and filled them up. But for weeks on end, no birds came. The seeds in the feeders stayed untouched and mosses flared up the sides of the clear plastic tubes. The songbird population, particularly the little chickadees, the juncos and finches, had suffered because ice had encased their food supplies, and we humans hadn't been able to provide for them. I would not have experienced any of this had we not moved from the city. It has felt like some kind of privilege, albeit at that time a sad one.
Thank you so much, Shani. Now our next finalist is Emily St. John Mandel. She's the author of novels, essays, and short fiction, and her previous novel, the acclaimed Station 11, was a multiple award winner that has been translated into 31 languages. Her eagerly anticipated follow-up, The Glass Hotel, according to the Scotiabank Giller Prize jury, is a boldly lyrical tale that commands a broad array of characters and a plot of kaleidoscopic intricacy. Please welcome Emily St. John Mandel.
We had crossed a line, that much was obvious, but it was difficult to say later exactly where that line had been. Or perhaps we'd all had different lines, or crossed the same line at different times. Simone, the new receptionist, didn't even know the line was there until the day before Alcaidus was arrested, which is to say the day of the 2008 holiday party, when Enrico came around to our desks in the late morning and told us that Alcaidus wanted us assembled in the 17th floor conference room at 1 o'clock. This had never happened before. The arrangement was something we did, not something we talked about. Alcaidus came in at 1:15, sat at the head of the table without making eye contact with anyone, and said, "We have liquidity problems." There was no air in the room. "I've arranged for a loan from the brokerage company," he said. "We'll route it through London and record the wire transfer as income from European trading." "Will the loan be enough?" Enrico asked quietly. "For the moment," he said. A knock on the door just then, and Simone came in with the coffee. No one was sure where to look. Simone had only been on the job for 3 weeks and wasn't party to the arrangement, but it was immediately obvious to her that something was amiss. Only Ron returned her smile. Jael stared blankly at her, as did Alcaidus. Oscar was looking very fixedly at a legal pad on the table before him, and it seemed to Simone that there were tears in his eyes. Enrico and Harvey were staring into space. Simone finished pouring the coffee, closed the door, and waited in the corridor instead of walking away. It seemed to her that no one spoke for an unnaturally long time. "Look," Alcaidus said finally, "we all know what we do here." Later, some of us would pretend that we didn't hear this, but Simone's testimony would echo the accounts of several of us who did hear it. Some of us who pretended not to hear it would also pretend not to know there was a line. "I'm as much a victim as Mr. Alcaidus's investors," Jael told a judge who disagreed and sentenced her to 12 years. But then at the far opposite end of the spectrum was Harvey Alexander, who would agree wholeheartedly with Simone's testimony and go on to confess to things he hadn't even been accused of in a kind of ecstasy of guilt. But for those of us who did hear what Alcaidus said in that meeting, those of us who admitted to hearing it, that statement represented the final crossing, or perhaps more accurately, the moment when it was no longer possible to ignore the topography and pretend that the border hadn't already been crossed. Of course, we all knew what we did there. We weren't idiots, except for Ron. We shuffled our papers, stared into space. We imagined leaving the country, Oscar, or made firm, actionable plans to leave the country, Enrico, or decided fatalistically that it was too late to go anywhere, Harvey, or indulged in the fantastical notion that somehow everything would work itself out, Jael. Ron glanced around, confused. He often seemed confused. The rest of us had noticed that about him, and it seemed he actually didn't know what we did here, which was baffling in retrospect. What did he think we were doing, if not running a Ponzi scheme? Still, there it was. He looked around in the silence, cleared his throat, and said, "Well, we have so much trading activity with the London office already, though." The silence that followed this remark was, if possible, even worse than the silence that had preceded it. No trade had ever been executed through the London office because the London office was comprised of a single employee with 5 email addresses whose job consisted primarily of wiring funds to New York to give the appearance of European trading activity. "That's an excellent point, Ron," Harvey said. He spoke kindly and with a certain sadness.
Thank you, Emily. And now our final reading of the night. Souvankham Thammavongsa is the author of 4 award-winning poetry books. Her short story collection, How to Pronounce Knife, rounds out this year's Scotiabank Giller Prize shortlist. All the more impressive because this is her debut book of fiction, which the jury calls a stunning collection of stories that portray the immigrant experience in achingly beautiful prose. Reading an excerpt from the short story, Randy Travis, please welcome Souvankham Thammavongsa.
The only thing my mother liked about the new country we were living in was its music. We had been given a small radio as part of the welcome package from the refugee settlement program. There were other items in the box, such as snow pants, mittens, and new underwear. But it was the radio she cherished most. A metal box with a dial that picked up a few channels. The volume button had only 3 ticks, and then it couldn't go any further to the right. She held this little radio up to her ear like a seashell and listened. The host always spoke briefly between songs, and there was the occasional laugh. A laugh in any language was a laugh. His laugh was gentle and private and welcoming. You got the sense that he too was alone somewhere, grateful for the sound of the human voice and for the music that kept her company. She listened to the radio constantly while I was at school and my father was at work. My mother especially loved American country music because it reminded her of the way the women in her family talked among themselves. It felt familiar. The pleas, the gossip, the dreams of the big city, what it was like to come from a place no one had ever heard of. The songs always told you a story you could follow, ones about heartbreak or about love, how someone can promise to love you forever and ever and ever. Amen. The songs my mother loved most were by Randy Travis. My father was nothing like Randy Travis. No one noticed who he was or what he did for his living. He never used the word love or showed much sentiment. For my mother's birthday, he gave her a few $20 bills, not even a birthday card or plans for a night out. He thought that because he was there, that was all that was needed to show his love. He thought his silence was love, his restraint was love. To say it out loud, to display it so openly, is to be shameless. He thought it was ridiculous to be moaning about love so much. What kind of man was Randy Travis, with his health, his looks, his fame, and his money, that he should ever have anything to cry about? One morning, my mother gave me some money to buy one of those Teen Bop magazines so we could find a mailing address for Randy Travis at the back of it. She brought out a card printed with a pink heart on the front, but because she couldn't read or write English, she told me to write a note to him for her. I did not know what to write. I must have been about 7. What could I know then about the language of adult love? While she curled a few strands of her hair around a finger and broke out in small fits of giggles, I stood there, unable to decide how to even begin a sentence to him. I didn't like how she was acting, and I was afraid of what would happen to my father if Randy Travis ever wrote back. So I wrote, "I do not like you." My mother would never know what I had written. I told her I'd written, "I love you forever and ever," just like his song. She smiled and then signed her name underneath. We sent these cards to Randy Travis again and again. And though no one ever wrote back, my mother insisted we keep on sending them. I tried to think of what to write and thought of the things people wrote in the bathroom at school or spray painted on the brick outside our building. "You're ugly. Go back home. Loser." We must have sent out hundreds of these cards, spending money on stamps and envelopes. My mother always hoping to get something back. It wasn't any different than what she had done to come to this country, she said.
Thank you, Souvankham. And there you have it, folks, a taste of 5 incredible books, each work stunning and beautiful in its own way. Now, the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize shortlist was selected by an esteemed 5-member panel featuring jury chair and author Mark Sakamoto, Canadian novelist Eden Robinson, David Sherry-Andy, and British-Canadian author Tom Rackman, as well as literary critic Claire Armistead. Now we're going to transition into the question period where I get to ask you all the questions I want to know and you search your minds for the best answer or just the answer that comes to you. I want to start, I love to begin with something that I know readers love to find out. One of the reasons people, I think, tune in to conversations like this is to find out a little bit of the backstory, a little bit of the journey to arriving at this moment. And so I'd like to ask you if you could each share how this book that you've created began and how close it is to the idea you had at the beginning, how long it took, And I'm going to start with you, Jill, because I know you had a little bit of writing a sequel. There's, of course, a little bit of a lead-in. So can you tell us a little bit about how this book emerged?
This is a sequel or a follow-up to my first novel, The Outlander, but I was careful when I was writing it to make sure that it stands on its own. It's a standalone, and there's no need to read the first novel to understand this one. But I was doing book club readings and various readings around, and I went to a pretty big book club in Alberta. I think it's called the Banff Book Weekend. And we'd done our event, and they were moving on to other writers, and I was done. And there was a woman sitting next to me, and she was kind of talking to herself, and she was asking herself what two of the characters in the book were going to be like as parents. And this is what you do after you finished a book. Often you close it and you walk away and you start thinking about what happens next. And the reason I loved that was because I knew exactly what they would be like as parents, because I'd created them. They're my characters. But the question that fascinated me was, what would their child be like? What kind of person would they produce? What kind of person would they, nurture and teach? And almost immediately, the child came to me as a character. And so your question was, how close was my original, concept to the final book? Kind of amazingly very similar to the idea. But perhaps a lot of writers will have this exact thing, where the original thing is really just an image. It's just this very coherent notion, image, sometimes just a phrase or a word, and it comes packed with all of its own, wonderful things that you can use to create the book. So short answer is, it ended up the way I wanted it to be. Not a surprise, I suppose, because I wrote it, but yeah, it came from a book clubber.
I love that.
Thinking about, what was going to happen next.
I love that. It's such a great thing for people watching, too, to remember how they shape what happens in books and stories. So Emily and Shani, either one of you have sort of how it began story?
I had a visual arts life before writing. And when I finish a novel, I think to myself, well, should I probably go straight back to painting or do some photography or something? When I finished my last novel, I actually really thought I would not write again, because I just missed my visual arts and my photography. I finished a photography project and I think I must start to write, or, so it's back and forth, back and forth. And after that, my last novel, I thought, okay, that's it. I'm not writing again. And within a week, I began to write. What happened is that I did, in fact, have a friend come to visit. And he told me a story, a really beautiful love story, his life story. And he said to me, "You're a writer, please write this story for me." I wasn't writing, so I thought, okay, fine, I'll start to write it, see where it goes, because it really was a lovely story. But not far into it, I began to enjoy the process of writing, but I wasn't interested in his story. I really wanted to just follow my own, this character that he supposedly fell in love with. Actually, I began to take on her voice, and she began to contradict everything that he said. And I really wanted to follow that. Now, in my visual art practice, many, many years ago, before I wrote, I knew of this performance piece, and I believe it's by Jasper Johns, and the lines of the performance, the directions for it are: take an object, do something to it, do something to it. I think it's Jasper Johns. And anyway, it goes on and on and on, do something to it. When I sat down to write my very first novel, Sirius Blooms at Night, that's what I followed, because I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where the novel was going to go, the story was going to go. And that's been how I've written always. I love that process of discovery, just letting the characters take you, letting the momentum. And basically that's what I did. So yes, it exactly as Jill said. Sorry, opposite to what Jill said. The story was very, very far from where I began. And every step was new for me. At the end of it, I came back, to see what I'd done, and then I could fill it in and make what was there stronger.
What about you, Emily?
Similarly to Shani, the final version of The Glass Hotel is a million miles away from what I thought the book would be when I first started. With this book, every character in this book is fictional, but it is based around the central crime, which is based on Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, which collapsed in New York City in 2008. I was fascinated by that crime, not really for the scale of it, although that was astounding. That was a $65 billion with a B dollar US financial fraud. What fascinated me was that crime required a staff. And at the time, I had a really great day job for a writer. I was a part-time administrative assistant in a cancer research lab at the Rockefeller University in New York. So it was a really interesting environment with really interesting, intelligent people. I loved seeing them every day. And what I found myself thinking about was the camaraderie that you have with any group of people who works together. You're coming to the office with a sense of shared mission. And then I found myself thinking how much stranger and more complex and wilder would that camaraderie be if you were bound together by a crime, if you were showing up at work to perpetuate a massive financial fraud. It's kind of astounding to me to think about people doing that day in, day out over a period of years. So the first part of the book that I started writing was actually the section that I read, which after 5 years and several dozen rounds of revision ended up being chapter 10. So yeah, my original idea was I was going to write a novel that was very narrowly focused around this crime that had interested me. But similarly to Shani, I don't write from an outline. It is a process of discovery for me, figuring out what the book is going to be. And at the end of this long process, I found I'd written a ghost story that had a crime in it. So I would say it's really very far from what I thought it would be when I started.
And Souvankham, with your short story collection, was it something you knew you were always going to have all those stories together in a book? Or did you write some of the short stories and sort of decide at a certain point, okay, I've got enough to put them all together in a book?
I wanted to write a short story collection where they orbited around the opening story, How to Pronounce Knife. That was based on a real life event. When I was a kid, I didn't know how to pronounce the word knife. And I asked my father, and he told me it's knife. And so I went to school and I read that word in front of the class, and I was told that it was wrong. But I refused to say it the way that I was being told to say it, because I thought, well, there's a letter right in front. Why do we not give a letter that's right in front any sound? I mean, what is it there for then? In my own experience, not knowing how to pronounce that word, I did not feel sad or ashamed or humiliated. What I felt was alone with that language, and I wanted to capture that moment of when I was a little kid. And that idea of failure is something all the stories circle around. Often when we hear stories about immigrants and refugees, we hear about them when they become a success. But sometimes, the person that's trying to get to the next minute, the next hour, the next year, that's a hero too, and they deserve to be at the center of a story.
David, you also put out a collection, but it's a little bit different in that there are short stories at the front end and then a novella at the back end, which you read from. Was that always the plan?
No, there was no plan. I typically I started with stories when my first book was short stories because I didn't know how to write a novel. And stories seemed the easiest way to write fiction for me. So I thought, well, if I can learn how to write a story, then and I can put together a collection, that's great. Then I discovered that maybe I could write a novel, and I did. But in between those novels, I would write stories when they sort of fell on my head. I didn't go out looking for them. And so the collection itself was written over 21 years. And the first story written in the collection, somewhere in the middle, was I entered it for a CBC short story contest, and it won. And that sort of gave me impetus to write more of, which is what prizes always do, of course. They give you this ego boost, and so you think you're brilliant, and so you go out and do more. So I spent probably one a year. I wrote one a year, and then I was working on a novel, which became the novella, and I'd written 300 pages, and I realized this is not working, and I got feedback, and it was agreed that this was not working. So I chopped off 200 pages, and it became a novella, and I threw the rest out. And it became a much better story, I think, and it worked as a novella, something I've never written before, but love to read. One being Family Happiness, for example, or the Death of Ivan Illich. Great novella. Novella is very powerful, and if it works, it works. And in this case, I think it works. So it was a long process, but I'm happy it all came together.
I have to ask about those 200 pages, because as a writer, I just think, oh my gosh. Was that an easy thing when they came back to you and said, like, most of this has to go? Or was there a little bit of time?
They didn't tell me that it had to go. They just said, it's a lousy novel. And so I looked at it and said, okay, maybe it's a lousy novel. And so I tried to figure out, how do I salvage anything from this? And that became the novella. And so someone telling me it was a lousy novel was probably a really good thing. And you just have to hear it sometimes from someone else that this is not working.
Well, one of the questions I was going to ask, that I want to ask is about that a little bit. It's about criticism. I think one of the things that's a mixed bag of goodies for writers is when you get into a position like this, you're on the shortlist, lots of people now know about the book, and therefore you're open to a lot more feedback, maybe a bit of criticism. How do you handle all that comes with that?
I wouldn't have thought that I'd ever be able to say this of myself earlier in my career, but I feel like at a certain point you develop nerves of steel. At this point, I always get a bad review in the New York Times, and with this novel, it didn't bother me. So I think at first it's really, really hard, or it was for me with my first couple of books, and probably even my third book. And then it just, for me anyway, it just starts to you start to. I don't want to say you care less, because of course you always care about the quality of the work, but it bothers you less when individuals don't like it, in my experience.
I want to be more like you.
It took 5 books.
Yeah. And I think Sue said something earlier about, by the time the book comes out, you've worked on it for however long. It's been edited and stepped on and edited again. And it comes out from the printer and it's done. So even if there is some criticism, let's say from, a review, there's nothing you can do. It's like, I'd like to help you, but the book is done and I'm on to something else now. So yeah, the cake's already come out of the oven. It's over.
Right.
I agree. It's out of your hands, and it's out in the world, and there's not much you can do about it. And that's a wonderful thing. I've been told by people in my household that I'm not allowed to look at any Goodreads reviews, and I'm also, I believe that you're never as good as people say you are, and you're never as bad as people say you are. So I sort of tend to look at that as a way of survival.
It doesn't bother me whether it's bad because I think I'm smarter than my critics. And also, I worked with Anita Chong, 8 hours of conversations. Everything that appears on the page, I wrestled with her about it. And no critic is as bad as the one that's in my head.
I grew up in Trinidad, and I knew from the time I was very, very young that I wanted to be an artist. And there wasn't support for that idea at all. And I kind of had to find ways to work on my own. And I was constantly asking people I met who were artists for feedback. And the thing that I couldn't stand was when they told me something was good. That's not what I wanted to know. I wanted to know when something wasn't working. And that I would listen to. I would listen to it, think about it, and there came a point where I could make my own decision. Perhaps they are right, perhaps they're wrong. And I really trained myself like that for a long, long time. Now, at this point, I don't really show anyone my writing. Well, there are about 3 people I show, but I don't show beyond that before it's finished. And then, of course, my agent, my publisher, and my editor see the writing. But I don't pay attention. Even with my editor, who is absolutely fantastic, I would wrestle with her, as Sue is saying. But after the book is out in the world, yes, I too, David, have been told not to. Who was it that said about the Goodreads?
I was the
You did.
I was the
Okay.
one. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've been told that. Still, I peep, and what I find myself, what happens is I feel very deflated when there is a negative idea, even though I can tell that idea is very, very poorly conceived. Still, it bothers me. But all it takes is a good one to make me feel good again, and then a bad one to make me feel bad again, and back and forth.
I love that. You mentioned, Shani, Trinidad, and one of the things that always interests me in books is the setting of the story and the authors behind the settings. And so I wanted to ask you all about the places that you've lived and the places that you've visited, and how they shape the choice you made about where your stories are set in terms of the places. And I'll start with you, Emily, because you've moved around a lot, and your story has a couple of different settings. So how did that come about? What was behind that choice?
Yeah, I'm from British Columbia originally. I grew up on Vancouver Island and then on Denman Island, between Vancouver Island and the mainland. And then I lived in Toronto and Montreal before I came to New York City. What it comes down to for me when I think about setting is that I'm not really comfortable setting a novel in a place where I haven't lived. Because, you get the smallest detail wrong and you'll get 300 emails from readers saying, well, there's actually no candy store on Main Street in that particular town. And you're like, oh God. So, I find it a little bit less fraught to set fiction in places that I know very well. Or if it's not a place that I know very, very well, like Northern Vancouver Island. I grew up to the south and east of where the Vancouver Island sections of the Glass Hotel are set. If it's not a place I know very, very well, then I'll fictionalize the place. I'll create a village where none exists, that kind of thing. So the Glass Hotel, it's Vancouver Island, and then it's New York City, where I've lived for quite a while now. And those are 2 places that I'm just very comfortable with.
What about you, David? I know you're joining us from Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm.
How have the places that you've lived, visited, how do they shape what you choose or where you choose to set your stories?
These stories, they sort of go far and wide. There's one set in Vietnam where I lived for a number of years, and there's one set near Guatemala where I go to. The novella, of course, is set in southern Manitoba, where I grew up, and it has sort of that religious texture to it. Not sort of, it definitely has a religious texture to it. And I grew up in that kind of a, not in that kind of a really strict culture, but my father was a preacher. I was there were certain rules I had to follow until I decided, I'm going to move on. But the stories in Winnipeg are definitely Winnipeg, and sometimes I think, well, who wants to read about Winnipeg? It's a backwater, and so there's a love-hate sort of affair that I have with the city, and yet it is a place that is ripe for great stories, and so that's where a lot of the stories come out of too, and so I travel. Living in places like Emily said, when you live in a place, well, here's sort of a story. A person goes on a 2-week trip, they'll write a novel. If they go and live in the place for a year, they'll write a short story. If they live there for 3 years, they'll write nothing. Because I think the longer you live in the place, the more you realize how little you know about the place and how there's a misapprehension of the other.
Shani, I saw you nodding when David shared that.
Leaving a place in which you grew up, where all your memories, your history, your family, everything you learned, everything that has touched you, food, colors, carnival. I'm talking about Trinidad. So I was born in Ireland, but I grew up in Trinidad. You leave that place and you leave all the people behind. I find, not you, but I keep wanting to recapture that, to write it. And in some ways, I had for a long time been writing to Trinidad, as it were. And I had dinner with Vidya Naipaul one night in a few years before he died. And I remember him saying to me, it's really struck me like a knife inside of me, which he's capable of doing. Why do you keep writing this coconut tree snow business? Why don't you write something that you don't know? And that seemed radical, totally radical, because it's the opposite of what we tell people who are learning to write. We tell them, write what you know. And here was this big writer telling me, write what you don't know. At the same time, living in cities in Canada, I find that people like me, people who have come from elsewhere, particularly people of color, we live in cities, and we write about the cities. We write about our interactions, the good parts, the bad parts, but it's almost like the city is a bit of a jail. And I wanted now to write, when I moved to Prince Edward County, I thought to myself, this is a really, really good opportunity to try to learn Canada. What I loved in Trinidad was landscape. It was, the water, the trees. And I found that actually in the city, I didn't photograph. I wasn't drawn to photographing there. As soon as I came to the county, I started photographing. And I began a project sponsored by a Chalmers Fellowship, where I was going to try to photograph, paint, and write the landscape around me. And in a lot of ways, that section that I wrote was one of the first parts of it wasn't a part of the novel, it was outside of the novel. And when I began to write this novel and my character started getting really sort of own way and not paying attention to me and going off on her own, I slipped that part into the novel, the polar vortex that I was experiencing. And the novel gave me an opportunity to exercise that, trying to get the landscape of Canada into this Trinidad mouth. So I would write it with some kind of Trinidad accent, but a Canadian landscape.
What about you, Sue?
I can really relate to what Shani was saying about write what you don't know. I don't know about the country where I'm actually from. My parents are refugees. They built a raft made of bamboo to get to a refugee camp in Thailand. And that's where I was born. And when you're born in a refugee camp, you're considered stateless. You belong to no country. So in my stories, none of my characters are sentimental about home. In fact, I build all my stories out of a place that I just referred to with the word here. I don't give readers their bearings. I don't tell them where we are or where we will be. I have no fidelity to home.
There's so much to unpack there that I enjoyed in the short stories, but I want to get a moment to ask Jill, because yours is a bit different than the others in that, you born and raised, you live in Toronto, and yet your story is set in this very wild, vast landscape. What was the decision behind that? What fascinated you? Because you've spent so much time now in this space with these two books.
I have, and I think because I was born in Toronto, right downtown, and I've spent so much of my life in a big city, apart from a little bit of time in Australia when I was a child, and also Japan. I'm not from out west, but my mother was, and she was from Edmonton. And when I was younger, I lived in the town of Banff. And I believe, for me anyway, there's sort of two places that I can write about are either home, which is a place that I know very well, for better or worse, a great big Canadian city, or the place where I really felt free and on my own, and I've always loved it. And I think everybody has that, maybe one or two places where they feel like it's their other home, and they think about it when they're not there. And if you're a writer, you maybe write about that and imagine yourself there. So for me, I've intermittently spent time out there, and I keep going back almost obsessively. And the research for Ridgerunner and also for The Outlander involved just going out there and actually standing where the characters would have stood. And yeah, that's either home or your heart's home. So
I want to finish with a question that has some rules and some parameters, because I want to talk about endings, but I want you all to promise no spoilers, because it's really important to me. I've read them, but I hate spoilers. I love when we get a chance to talk about books in this way, but I want to make sure no one drops any little secrets that will throw off readers. I want to ask you, and Souvankham actually sort of set this up a little bit with the last answer in talking about her intentions and sort of what some of the choices she made and some of the experiences she was thinking about. And my question is about endings and what you want to give your readers at the end of the book. What either the experience or the feeling or the mood or what's sort of your goal. And for those of you with the short story collections, it can either be across all of your short stories or some of your short stories, or the last story in the collection. So depending on how you see the thought of endings, I'm curious about what you're thinking about when you're giving readers your ending.
Stories end differently than novels, I think, and there has to be a bit of a jolt. There has to be a bit of but it also has to be open. There has to be something where the reader moves beyond the end of the story, and I don't think it's the end of anything. It's probably opening up into something else. And in the novella, I've been constantly surprised at how readers respond to the ending, because I thought it was a certain way and they see it a different way. And so, which is kind of great fun, because who am I to argue with the reader? And I know what I think the ending is, but they have a very different take on it. So that what I imagined was the ending was very different for the reader, for some of the readers.
Souvankham, do you have the same feeling with stories, how you want them to end versus how you might think about something longer?
Yes, I don't want my stories to end neatly with a bow tie. I don't want to solve anything for anybody. what I'm thinking about when I'm ending a story is brutality and cruelty. I want a reader to be mad at me that it's ended. And I love, and they don't see it coming. And I've seen some of those reactions online, and I think, yes, that's what I set out to do.
Emily, what about you? What's the goal for readers when they get to the end of your books?
I guess for me, it kind of feels like a balancing act where on the one hand, I don't want it tied up too neatly. But on the other hand, I don't actually want to infuriate my readers. So, I want there to be some feeling of closure without it being too tidy. And I guess what I'd say in summary is that endings are really hard. So, it's hard to stick the landing.
Yeah. Shani, what do you think?
I find that I'm often asked by readers, what happens next? What happened to so-and-so? And they even tell me, do you think she's going to do this? And I always say, well, it's yours to write. You go write it now, because I'm not interested. I'm finished. But I don't want it to, I don't want what I write, to end up saying anything. So when you ask what do I want to leave my reader with? I guess I want to leave my reader with their own thoughts about what next.
Well, Jill, you finished a book and then it opened into another book. And so what's sort of the goal for you? Was it different with Ridgerunner than it was with The Outlander? Were you thinking about that?
I had hoped I wasn't going to write what amounted to a sequel. I thought it would just be something I could reuse, but that it would turn into a different story, but it didn't. I agree that endings are extremely hard. They're very important. And in my case, the only thing that I really insisted for myself was that the end of the book speak to the beginning, so that there is a sense of unity to it. And again, because endings are hard, you don't know if you can pull that off. And I hope anyway that I pulled that off. It reminded you what you guys were talking about reminded me what Shani was talking about, experimental film. There's a filmmaker called Kelly Riekert, and she had a movie called Meek's Cutoff. And the very last shot of that film I watched in what you can't do anymore, in a large live audience. And the audience reaction was amazing, because she did not give them the tidy ending. She did not give them what they were expecting. And yet, in one single shot, she ended it perfectly, I think.
Fun little question to almost finish up. I want to know, November 9th is Giller Night, and how are you going to celebrate? Shani, you have a big smile on your face. You have a plan, an idea?
Yes. So I have a body of photographs on show at Eno Gallery here in Prince Edward County, and that was planned quite a while ago, long before the long list came out. And of course, when the shortlist came out, Colin Moulton, who's the director of Eno, said to me, "We have to do it socially distanced, yes, masked, yes, but we have to do it at the gallery." And so she has organized a really nice little thing with a few of my friends, my agent, Samantha Haywood, my publishers, Jay and Hazel Millar, and my partner, and two other friends. And we will go to the gallery and have fun. Now, you have to remember that this is the fourth novel I've had on the Giller list. And what I know at this point is that enjoy it tremendously right to the end.
I think we're just going to have, we're probably just going to open a very nice bottle of wine and say we made it. We made it through the very exciting event and all the events that, the Giller people have put together for us. And it will be nice.
Souvankham, you have this beautiful wallpaper behind you. Do you have like a special wallpaper for Giller Night?
No, it will be this. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my mom and dad. They don't know what the Giller is. My mom works in a factory and my dad makes signs. So they're very far from that. I hope they don't accidentally catch me on TV. But I want to spend the night alone. I know in the instructions or the manifest that was sent over, we should spend it with family and people who love us. But, you can be a family by yourself. You can be loved by yourself. And that's how I'm going to spend it.
Same here, actually. I don't want to bring anybody down too horribly, but given what the pandemic has been like in New York City, I'm just not comfortable with any kind of gathering indoors. So I think it'll just be me and a camera guy on my terrace, which sounds depressing, but you know what? It's such an honor. I'm so happy to have been nominated for this with all of you. And it doesn't feel sad to me when I think about that evening.
I have 3 sons living in Winnipeg with their partners. And when this first came out, I wrote them and said it'd be great to get together. This was before Winnipeg started to get high numbers in COVID. And I think we're way up there now. I think we're just under Quebec. And so we're pretty excited about that, but I think that'll have to be canceled. So it'll be my wife and myself. And I also have a daughter in Montreal, and I'll probably make contact with her. But it'll be the 2 of us and drinking wine, and of course the cameraman. And that should be great fun for him.
When my family in Trinidad and my siblings in England, they've been so excited about this. And I keep saying to them, yes, it's the 4th time. Don't be so overly anxious. And Daddy kind of carried on. And I said, Dad, I really, really am worried. I don't want to disappoint you. And he said to me, darling, you can't disappoint us. The people, if the book does not get on, if the book is not finally chosen, the people who have made these choices are the ones who will disappoint us.
The hardest part I think about this is that typically, and having gone through this before, is that you get to know the finalists in a really intimate way, and it's a lot of fun, and it's a you think you're going in to meet these people who are competition or whatever, but it's not that at all. You grow to really like them, and that's what I miss about the fact that we won't be at a Giller bash and we won't be able to hug each other and congratulate each other and then drink in the bar after and talk about what's going on. So that this is it's very different.
Jill, David, Emily, Shani, and Souvankham, congratulations. And thank you so much for sharing your work and your process with all of us tonight in the very first virtual edition of Between the Pages. Thank you again to our sponsors, Scotiabank, Scotia Wealth Management, CBC, the Globe and Mail, Audible, Ben McNally Books, and of course, the Giller Foundation. My special thanks to you, the audience of book lovers everywhere, for joining us tonight. I hope, like me, you found tonight enlightening. I hope you found it thought-provoking and, of course, inspiring. Remember, one of our authors will take home the 2020 Scotiabank Giller Prize and will walk away with the award and $100,000. Who will it be? Find out on Monday, November 9th on CBC TV, CBC Radio 1, on CBC Gem, and cbcbooks.ca. The gala broadcast, brought to you commercial-free by Scotia Wealth Management, will be hosted by Eric McCormick with special musical guest Diana Krall. Thank you again for joining us. Good night, Canada, and happy Gillers.